She marched across my driveway like she owned every snowflake, and before I could even set a hand on the snowbank, she handed me a $500 violation notice. I'm a paramedic and firefighter. I run into wrecks, into frozen shoulders, into people's worst days, and yet somehow a set of tire chains nearly cost me my peace, my reputation, and a lot of money. That first night with the chains rattling against the wheel wells of my Ford F350 and the wind trying to talk through the pines, I realized how tiny authority can feel enormous when wielded by the wrong person. It was January. We'd been hammered with 18 inches of fresh powder, and I'd just staggered off a 36-hour shift hauling equipment through drifts, slicing people out of crumpled metal, patching strangers with gauze and blunt words, the kind of work that leaves you sore and hollow and grateful for a warm bed. I pulled into Cascade Heights, a gated plateau that looks like postcard sincerity from the highway, and there she was, Patricia Morrison, HOA president, designer coat expression waxed thin. "Jeremy Hutchinson," she called out as if reading me from an agenda, "we need to talk about those chains." I explained, breath-fogging uniform, still smelling like smoke and disinfectant. "I'm a firefighter, Patricia. I need those chains to get through this storm." She flipped through her folder like a lawyer grooming a case, pulled out Section 7, Subsection 4, and read it to me like scripture: chains, studs, anything that could harm the community roads prohibited. "Take them off or you'll face a fine." She handed me a pink violation notice the way somebody hands you a formal postcard from trouble. You can imagine the choices: remove them, then sleep warm and small and let whatever bureaucratic wheel gnaw at you later, or stand your ground because a life might depend on traction. I chose the latter. I left the chains on. I kept thinking of calls where a minute or two changes the outcome, and for me that meant chains were not an act of defiance, but an act of duty. Deputy Mike Reynolds called that night like a lifeline. If your truck is registered as an emergency vehicle, the HOA can't prohibit necessary safety equipment, especially during a state emergency. He texted statute numbers, the kind of dry legal punctuation that suddenly felt protective. I slept with those statutes tucked next to my boots and drove to the next HOA meeting carrying the law like armor. Of course, being right on paper doesn't stop people who are certain from making rules feel sacred. Patricia had her photos, her narrative about ruined asphalt and increased HOA costs, her voice tuned to outrage. The boardroom smelled like cheap coffee and old minutes. When Patricia projected pictures of my truck and my driveway chains glinting in the streetlight, it looked for a heartbeat, like evidence in a trial. I stood, handed out copies of the law, and explained calmly as you can, when sleep and adrenaline have been your bedmates, that my vehicle is registered as an emergency response vehicle, that the governor had declared a state of emergency for the Front Range, and that these chains were a matter of safety, not rebelliousness. Some heads nodded, others closed. Patricia's reply was simple: the rules apply to everyone. Her certainty turned a policy discussion into a personal crusade. That's the ugly little truth about small authority, when people are certain they can make the law look optional. We argued, the board waffled, and the fines piled up, notices like tiny snowfall, relentless. My name began to travel as the guy who thinks he's above the rules, which was absurd, but gossip loves a villain and doesn't bother much with nuance. Then the escalation that felt less like policy and more like personal vendetta began. Certified letters from Patricia's lawyer landed on my porch, accusing me of harassment and demanding apologies and money. Code enforcement got a complaint claiming I was operating a business out of my home because of the presence of an emergency vehicle. A car idled across the street at 2 a.m. while someone took pictures of my house. Deputy Garcia ran the plates. It was Patricia. She was showing up like a shadow that wouldn't leave. When you've answered enough 911s, you learn the sound of things that mean trouble, and this sounded like stalking. I called my attorney, Marcus Palmer, who told me to document everything, to answer with facts and not emotion. Marcus's steady voice was the opposite of adrenaline. He sent letters, filed statements, and forced the HOA to look at the statute seriously. Eventually, the HOA attorney recommended removing the fines and updating the bylaws to reflect the emergency vehicle exemption. Publicly, the board reversed course. Privately, the neighborhood split. Some neighbors offered quiet apologies in chili and paper bowls. Others still avoided eye contact, their eyes carrying the muttered rumors Patricia had fed. For a while I thought we were done. The fines were removed, the board agreed to fix bylaws. Richard Chen, vice president, promised changes that actually helped people instead of policing them. Then came the thing that made my jaw drop, a call about a medical emergency at Patricia Morrison's house. We drove the same streets we'd argued over for months and found Patricia unconscious on her living room floor, empty pill bottles like punctuation around her. You learn fast whatever the history, someone's life in immediate peril takes precedence. I treated her the way I treat anyone, hands steady, no ledger in my head. I administered naloxone, monitored vitals, stayed professional, while 100 private grievances crashed around me. Her ex-husband stood there with tears tracking down his face and said, "Thank you." For a moment, the whole ridiculous, exhausting saga folded into one terrible human scene: the photographs, the fines, the idling car, and a person who had fallen apart. Seeing her like that didn't erase what she'd done. It reframed everything. She resigned from the board, entered psychiatric care, and moved away to be with family. The restraining order was extended once, then allowed to lapse when nothing more happened. The HOA updated the bylaws. Richard organized barbecues and fixed potholes. Tom Carter kept his garden and left tomatoes on my doorstep, and at a neighborhood meeting, someone presented me with a small plaque. It wasn't glory so much as a community's awkward attempt at repair. There are practical takeaways. Document everything, save the emails, photograph notices. Get a lawyer who reads statutes for fun. But the quieter lessons are the ones that stick. Being right is not the same as being healed, and justice is not always a neat ledger. Hurt people hurt people. Power without compassion can look like protection. Sometimes the person waving the rulebook is crumbling inside and lashing out because they have nowhere else to put their pain. So I stayed. I kept showing up for shifts, for neighbors, and for meetings. I started attending HOA sessions not to wage war, but to make sure the levers of small power were used sensibly. I pushed for rules that protected everyone and practiced the tedious work of community care, the kind that looks quiet but matters. We updated bylaws, we fixed roads, we planted a garden by the rec center. Life annoyingly went on. If you want a neat moral here, it is messy as it is. Stand up for what matters, document the fight. Use the law when you must, but remember that accountability without compassion can leave everyone poorer. Justice can mean fines are removed and bylaws rewritten, and justice can also mean someone finally gets help before things break utterly. Both are true, and neither one is the whole story. So here's the question I want to leave you with. When someone in a position of small authority misuses it, is punishment enough, or should our first impulse be to try repair, to couple accountability with outreach and support? I got my fines removed, I got a restraining order, I got a plaque. But what would have been different if someone's first act had been to ask, "You okay?" instead of filing a complaint? If you've ever been on the receiving end of petty authority, in an HOA at work, or in your neighborhood, tell me what you did. Did you fight back, fold quietly, or try to build a bridge? Drop your story below, share how it ended, or if it didn't, what you wish had happened. Sometimes the loudest lessons come from something as small as chains on a truck, and sometimes justice is less about winning and more about making sure nobody else falls the way Patricia did. Truly.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.